And welcome back. US President Donald Trump says he ordered the military attack on Iran to thwart Tehran's nuclear developments and ballistic missile program. Trump offered his most extensive comments about the war beyond two earlier pre-recorded video messages and a series of brief telephonic media interviews over the weekend that offered sometimes conflicting objectives in the conflict.
Today, the United States military continues to carry out large-scale combat operations in Iran to eliminate the grave threats posed to America by this terrible terrorist regime. Following our obliteration of Iran's nuclear program in Operation Midnight Hammer a short while ago, we warned Iran not to make any attempt to rebuild at a different location because they were unable to use the ones that we so powerfully blew up. But they ignored those warnings and refused to cease their pursuit of nuclear weapons. In addition, the regime's conventional ballistic missile program was growing rapidly and dramatically, and this posed a very clear, colossal threat to America and our forces stationed overseas. The regime already had missiles capable of hitting Europe and our bases, both local and overseas, and would soon have had missiles capable of reaching our beautiful America.
Well, let's unpack this further with SABC News correspondent Sherwin Bryce-Pease joining us from New York. Sherwin, it was quite clear that on the eve of this attack, the reports at least that were coming out, was that Iran made a number of incredibly profound concessions in that negotiations that was mediated by Oman as the interlocutor there. And importantly, Iran had conceded to let go of its enriched uranium, which is enriched to about 6%, which the Israelis and Americans claim is enough to form 10 nuclear warheads, while Iran maintains that it was entirely for energy purposes. And of course, Donald Trump had last year claimed that the 3 strikes in Tehran had obliterated the nuclear enrichment plants. Was any of that addressed in any of the messages and addresses that he's done over the weekend?
Yes, absolutely. And in the midst of the fog of war, in addition to the confusion that you've just laid out about, what narrative are we to believe here, President Trump earlier today talking about how essentially the reason for the strike on Iran, the joint Israeli-US operation, is to prevent Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon. But that is exactly what the diplomatic talks mediated by Oman, the last iteration of which was held in Geneva, Switzerland on Thursday. And the foreign minister of Oman came out on US media, including with CBS News, explaining some of the key concessions that you've just talked about in terms of that uranium enrichment and the stockpiling thereof, which the US and Western powers argue is a pathway to a nuclear weapon, despite the Iranians saying that the purposes of their nuclear program was essentially for academic and energy purposes, essentially for peaceful means. Therein lies this contradiction. Who are we going to believe now? The Omanis are saying an opportunity was missed here. That has been echoed by the UN Secretary General, who obviously favors a diplomatic approach to the resolution of all disputes, international disputes, and wants the UN Charter to be, the tenets of the UN Charter to be observed, territorial integrity, sovereignty of member states, and not to try to settle disputes through war and violence. And so where we go from here is a concern around the regional dynamics of this. This is not just a war now between the United States, Israel and Iran. There are implications for Gulf countries. Iran is targeting in its retaliation, which it is asserting in light of Article 51 of the United Nations Charter, which allows it to defend itself under armed attack. The concern here is that this is now going to become a regional conflict with regional implications and the humanitarian consequences, Oliver, that stems from that. I had an interaction with the Secretary General's spokesperson, Stefan Dujarric, earlier today. Let's watch that and I'll come back right after. reaction to the targeting of a head of state here? So soon after Venezuela's sitting head of state was removed and arrested and brought to the United States. What is your reaction to the U.S.'s unilateral actions in that regard?
Well, I mean, I think the reaction to the action we've seen by the U.S. and Israel, the Secretary General laid it out very plainly on Saturday, and that remains his position.
I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the expanding humanitarian consequences, particularly when there are wars, right? On an already overstretched humanitarian community. What does scenario planning look for the Tom Fletchers and the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs? How do you plan for this moment?
Well, we planned by having had contingency plans already in place. I mean, the impact here is multifold, right? You could have, obviously, a humanitarian impact in Iran, right? And we're already seeing the killings of civilians in other countries in the Gulf. What is particularly worrying as well is the closure of airspace. And you know, the UN has humanitarian hubs in the Gulf, notably in the UAE. A lot of our humanitarian goods move through that. So it could very well have an impact on our operations in Africa, in Asia, and other parts of the world. We're already talking about a humanitarian system which is extremely stretched and heavily underfunded. And this is an issue, I mean, I was just talking to our humanitarian colleagues a few minutes ago that they're worried about, and they're looking at what the impact will be on our logistics operation. I mean, the UN has a tremendous logistics operation, not only humanitarian, as well as peacekeeping. And when critical waterways are closed, when airspace is closed, it can have an impact pretty quickly.
And of course, Oliver, Stefan Dujarric there referring to comments made by the Secretary General during that emergency session of the Council on Saturday, where he said the region and the world need a way out now. I call for de-escalation and an immediate cessation of hostilities. The alternative is a potential wider conflict with grave consequences for civilians and regional stability. And boy, oh boy, are we not already seeing that play out today.
Yeah, just last and I think quite importantly here, is there any from the addresses Trump had issued out over the weekend, is there any room to return to last week Thursday's negotiation table?
It doesn't seem so in the short term. What you are hearing from Donald Trump, what you are hearing from Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense, what you are hearing from General Dan Kane, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, is that they are sending more assets, more fighter jets, more troops to the region. There's an escalation here. Iran is defending itself, and as you have seen in earlier newscasts, confirmation from the U.S. Central Command that 4 service people have now succumbed to their injuries from Iran attacks, the details of which we do not yet know. A number more U.S. service people injured, and of course civilian casualties, over 500 in Iran, almost a dozen plus in Israel. So the consequences and the civilian impacts here are very real to see. And this is, you know, the big thing we're watching in the United States, Oliver, is the United States Congress is seeking to insert itself here in this process, in this ongoing conflict. It wants to reassert its authority in terms of what is known as the War Powers Act of the United States. They want to pass a new War Powers resolution that seeks to curtail the president's authority here in terms of a long-standing foreign military intervention. The problem is for Congress to overrule the executive here, you're going to have to pass this War Powers resolution with a 2/3 majority in the House of Representatives and a 2/3 majority in the Senate to avoid a veto. So the cat's out of the bag in many ways here. Congress is trying to insert itself, but we have a war ongoing, so you can't really exactly put all those assets back in a box and bring them right back. You're in a viable and ongoing conflict here, so the off-ramp is unknown for now, and it's certainly not going to come from the UN Security Council, because right now the president of the UN Security Council is the United States. They preside over the council, and they have a veto.
The first meeting was called on Saturday by the French President Emmanuel Macron. When is the Security Council due to meet next to continue their discussion from Saturday's emergency meeting?
There is no scheduled Security Council meeting in this regard. Right now, the US First Lady is chairing a Security Council meeting focused on education, technology, and children in conflict. And as you know, there are reports out of Iran that a strike, we don't know if it was an Israeli-US strike, that struck an elementary school in southern Iran, killing dozens of people, many of whom are believed to be children. So the contradictions abound in terms of these conversations. But, you know, history shows us that the Security Council, as much as it might convene another meeting to discuss these issues, it's not necessarily the playground where you're going to resolve these issues. These tend to happen from regional powers, you know, the Turkeyas of the world, the UAE, the Qataris. What influence can they bring to bear? The Saudis, in terms of arresting this conflict. It's going to be a decision of the United States, the superpower, the most powerful military in the world, the most powerful economy in the world. It's really going to be up to Donald Trump, essentially the President of the United States, to make that call.
Yeah, we're going to have to leave it there. Sherwin, thank you so much for that. Really do appreciate it. Sherwin Bryce-Pease coming to us live there from New York.